I'm Sarah Newman, an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of the GIS in Latin America webinar series, which has been co-organized by the Center for Latin American Studies, or CLAS, and the Department of Anthropology, and sponsored by the Lickstern Fund of the Department of Anthropology. Before we introduce today's invited speakers, I want to start off by thanking Diana Schwartz-Francisco, Assistant Instructional Professor, and Lindsay Ortega, the Student Affairs Coordinator of CLAS, for collaborating with me to organize this series, which we hope will not only showcase scholars working in the humanities and social sciences who are conducting innovative research involving spatial analysis, but also allow us to connect with our geographically distant colleagues in Latin America during this unusual remote moment. We also hope to invite students and faculty to consider how spatial data can be used to enhance ongoing research projects, even while many of us are unable to conduct our usual field or archival work. And now, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Santiago Giraldo, who earned his PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago in 2010, is currently director of the Global Heritage Fund in Latin America and executive director of the Fundación Pro Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Daniel Rodríguez Osorio is a Wintergren Foundation Wadsworth International Fellow and currently a third-year graduate student in the Department of Anthropology and an interdisciplinary doctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming Santiago and Daniel for their presentation, The Use of LiDAR to Understand Anthropogenic Land Use and Occupation in the Upper Buritaca River Basin, Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, Colombia.
Hi, Sarah, Lindsay, Diana, thank you so much for having us. And of course, it's always good to be back at University of Chicago and have the time and have the audience to explain what we've been doing and what we've been up to in the past couple of years here in Colombia and in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. So we're going to be focusing on, in this talk, in basically some of the latest research that we've been conducting since 2019 in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta using LiDAR, both aerial and terrestrial, and how we got there, and the sorts of questions that we're trying to answer, and what we expect to find. Danny, if you can move on. So some acknowledgements, of course. National Geographic TV and Foundation were basically instrumental for us in terms of having access to LiDAR and to this data set. The Wintergren Foundation, of course, and University of Minnesota, where Danny is doing his doctoral research. ICANN, which is the Instituto Colombiano de Antropología e Historia, the Colombian Institute for Anthropology and History. Fundación Pro Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is where I happen to be the director. And David Cáceres, who is one of our very good friends and a park ranger at Ciudad Perdida. And he's always with us for all the ground truthing and for all the field work, really. What we've been focusing on, and the focus of this talk, is how we've been using remote sensing technologies in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, and how we can adapt these remote sensing technologies to the physical, topographic, and research conditions of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And then how do we use LiDAR actually to understand pre-Hispanic land use and occupation, which has been constant for the past 2,000 years in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta? And also, how do we make these visualizations, these tools, significant to archaeological research? Because they can simply be pretty images for the most part, and that's happened time and time again with many research projects, which end up producing these beautiful images, and then we really don't know or understand their relationship to archaeological research and questions and anthropological research as well. Next slide, Danny, please. So for everyone, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is one of the highest coastal mountains in the world. It goes from seaside, from the coastline, to 5,775 meters elevation within 40 kilometers of the coastline. It's a massive mountain, and its extent surpassed 17,000 square kilometers. It's subdivided into 3 departments or states here in Colombia. We've got the Magdalena on the left, Guajira on the right, and Cesar towards the south. And it has 3 indigenous reservations and 1 national natural park located within its boundaries. And we have Teyuna-Ciudad Perdida Archaeological Park, located in the upper midsection of the Buritaca River Basin. In this slide, what you see, all those little polygons, all those little blobs, are documented Tayrona sites spread throughout the northern and western sides of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which up to this point we have over 270. Those blank areas on the map aren't actually blank. They actually do have sites. The ise is that we haven't been able to go into those areas and document and map and locate those sites precisely. But I've walked most of the northern portion of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Danny has also, and we've walked also most of the western portion, and we have way too many sites for our own good. It's just, it's these truly massive amounts up to now. As I was saying, we've got 270 of them, but by extrapolation, we think that we're talking about of over 600 or even 700 sites spread throughout the northern and western side of the mountain. More recently, research began, next slide, Danny, with an expedition to Ciudad Perdida by the woman that you see there is Luisa Fernanda Herrera, who is an archaeologist that worked in the Sierra for many years. And she was in charge of the initial survey project wherein Ciudad Perdida was found. The man on the left is Frankie Rey, who used to be a looter and ended up being the first park administrator at Ciudad Perdida and led them to Ciudad Perdida. And the man on the right is Bernardo Valderrama, who is an architect that made part of the initial expedition. Ciudad Perdida was found around 1976, and it began to be rebuilt, reconstructed with just soldiers and massive amounts of labor in 1976. And from 1976 to 1981, it was under research and restoration. Our phase of research and the way that we began looking into more sophisticated ways of understanding what was happening in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta and trying to map out the extents of these towns and sites began around 2000 as I entered the doctoral program at University of Chicago. And with my professors there, we began examining different ways of actually understanding these sites and more sophisticated ways of mapping out these massive structures. And for that reason, what we began using was a combination of satellite imagery for one, which is what you saw initially, and total station survey work in these forested conditions. And these are, and in this image, what you see is a normal day of work out in the Sierra Nevada. We've got the total station, we've got a survey crew, we've got our linemen, line people, and we just walk out into the forest and begin mapping out the terraces that we've been scouting for. And this usually is extremely time consuming because the maps have to be very, very detailed. The structures are massive, and the amount of forest that we have to go through is, well, it's very, very dense, as you can see there. And so one of the issues which we began trying to address with Danny and with other colleagues was, how could we make this a bit more efficient? How could we, rather than randomly walking out into the forest and finding our way around in a pretty haphazard manner, because for the most part in these areas, in these canyons, in these river canyons, GPS signal is very weak And sometimes we'd get lost for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours while we were almost randomly moving about in the forest. Was, how do we find these places that we know are out there, that we know are in the vicinity of Ciudad Perdida in a more efficient, more strategic, and more precise manner that is less time consuming in resources, in labor, and basically in sweat for the most part, because these are month-long field seasons where we just walk around in the forest all day long. And sometimes we miss structures. Sometimes we can't really find them. And sometimes we get lost. Many times we get lost. And we don't know where we're going. And just having more precise locations and better coordinates really helps us out. This has been combined with excavation work, traditional excavation work, and also in new ways of documenting these structures that you see for conservation purposes. We've been running through GHF for the past 10 years, a pretty comprehensive conservation project at Ciudad Perdida. There had been no conservation work for over 20 years. And so we had a massive backlog of conservation. These are rammed earth and stone masonry structures that have been highly affected by climate change, by hurricanes in the Caribbean. Because the mountain is so high, what tends to happen is that the tail of the hurricane hits the upper parts of the mountain where Ciudad Perdida is located. And we have tree fall, we've got uprootings, we've got landslides, and we've got all sorts of troubles. And so we've been trying out new techniques, not only for visualizing, but for documenting these structures that involve drones. And we tried drones for documenting the area, and they weren't very effective. Flying drones underneath a forest canopy is pretty risky business, and it's outrageously expensive. Danny can tell you about the couple times where we've lost drones due to entanglements with lianas and with vines and creepers, and hours spent looking for drones near the river and out in the forest. And dead drones are definitely not fun. So the images that you see right here have been taken with a very long pole that we have to use to actually do this. And this is very detailed architectural survey work. And so we've been trying to find new ways of being able to document in extreme detail everything that is done to structures as they make part of conservation purposes. That's where LiDAR came in. And so we began exploring the use of LiDAR around 2018, but the technology as such is expensive. And trying out new technologies is always a rather risky business. We, of course, knew that LiDAR was becoming quite popular in Mesoamerican archaeology for the most part, but it had never been tried out in conditions such as the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta, where you have an extremely steep topography, extremely complicated flying conditions as well. This isn't a place for flying a Cessna. It's a place where if LiDAR was to be done, it had to be done using a helicopter. And flying helicopters is outrageously expensive. And we were also looking into using terrestrial LiDAR as well, to be able to document in fuller detail these structures that you see here. And so what this photograph illustrates is the core or central area of Ciudad Perdida. But these are the conditions under which we find all these structures. And Ciudad Perdida is actually quite massive. It's 33 hectares. And many of the structures are underneath that forest canopy that appears there as overgrown broccoli. And that's basically what you see and what you're walking under all day long when you're doing survey work in the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta. So it's not that easy to, for one, do survey work, and two, to prove that these, the LiDAR was actually going to be useful, because there's very many areas that, due to the topography, would appear blank if the pilot doesn't really know what they're doing. And the other remote sensing technique that we had tried out was photogrammetry. But photogrammetry, although useful in all those parts of the sites that are quite open and that have few vegetation, was proving to be very, very complicated with the forest cover. Danny, yeah, sure, we can move to the next slide. And so what we ended up being able to do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, was that National Geographic emailed me at the end of 2018 and said, hey, you know, we'd like to try out LiDAR around the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, around Ciudad Perdida, and it would be really good if you could be in on the project. And I said, well, of course, you know, if we're going to be doing LiDAR and we're really going to be doing it on National Geographic's dime, well, then for sure. And just to add a little bit more context, the area of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, as far as we know, has been inhabited since 200 AD by a number of groups that nowadays are classified under a very general moniker as the Teyuna. The Teyuna didn't really exist. What we had were a variety of independent polities that lived in this mountain on the northern side of the mountain and on the western side of the mountain, and built these massive rammed earth and stone masonry towns that were what the Spanish found in the 16th century. And then as epidemics or pandemics, such as the one that we're suffering through, came into the area in the 16th century, all of these towns became completely depopulated and we had population collapse reaching 90%. Nowadays, the area is occupied by peasants, by colonos, by farmsteaders that colonize the lower parts of the mountain, and 4 indigenous groups, which are the Kogi, the Arhuaco, the Wiwa, and the Cancuamo. And not to get into that, but of course they do relate to these structures, and they have a pretty long story regarding what they believe these sites are and who inhabited them and who inhabits them now. So in this section, what we're seeing, wait a second, Danny, like move back, Danny. So just to be clear, in this section, what we were able to do with LiDAR, with the LiDAR data, and this is the initial LiDAR data that we received from National Geographic, is that we were able to strip away all of the vegetation in that watershed, in that part of the watershed, and go down to a 30-centimeter resolution, so about a 1-foot resolution, that allowed us to see all of the masonry structures that were located below the canopy, and also the stone-paved roads and trails that lead in and out of the site. And so those lines that you see are actually stone-paved paths that lead to other sites in the upper parts of the basin. What we also wanted to do was to be able to see if LiDAR could actually tease out more sites, more areas that we had not been able to visit and that we had not detected in the prior 10 years of survey work. And what you'll see in the second part of the talk is, as Danny goes in, is that effectively what happened was that LiDAR proved to be absolutely crucial, and we were able to actually use LiDAR to detect at least another 10 or 11 sites that we had not been able to detect using traditional survey techniques such as field walking and being lost in the forest, which I can always relate to Shannon Dottie's idea of serendipitous archaeology, because we actually do find things by serendipitously walking out in the forest and suddenly finding massive stone structures out there. So getting lost is also part of research. We combined aerial LiDAR as well with terrestrial LiDAR. And one of the beautiful aspects of being able to work with National Geographic is that they wanted to do this for a TV show. So rather than, say, following our traditional research protocols, which mean not enough funds for doing everything that we want, in this case, we were able to do aerial LiDAR and terrestrial LiDAR at the same time to be able to see what was more effective in teasing out different variables in different parts of the structures, and also to be able to pose more sophisticated questions based on real data rather than on what we thought was being, what we thought was going to be produced by the LiDAR and by the aerial LiDAR, or what we thought was going to be produced by the terrestrial LiDAR. So it was extremely useful to be able to do this very rapidly. It was also extremely useful to have a very experienced team of British surveyors that do this all the time. I mean, this is basically what they do, which are called visual skies. And the surveyors were actually trained archaeologists as well. So Duncan Lees, who was one of the surveyors that was part of the team, is also a trained archaeologist, and he knows what we're looking for, which is very different when we work, say, with surveyors who are accustomed to surveying, I don't know, heaps of coal or buildings or that sort of thing. So now you're going to see a very short video of the whole sequence that was the way that we set up the research project and program here. So this is the core area of Ciudad Perdida. This is what you're seeing. And this is Duncan right there sitting on the helicopter leaving out of Santa Marta. So Ciudad Perdida is only accessible by helicopter, or you have to walk in a day and a half or 2 days. And so the task was pretty massive. We had to survey all this using multiple capture methods. And these are the terrestrial LiDARs out there. We used Leica stations to capture more than 2 million points per second. Drones, of course, for photographing and photogrammetry as well. And then the LiDAR unit that was attached to the helicopter, which allowed us to scan a pretty large area. But this regal head was actually clocked in a particular way because it's so steep. And so once the scanning was done, we had a massive amount of data, more than 5.5 billion points to go through. And then this was uploaded into an AR app, and this is how you would have seen the site as it was populated with structures as well. And so this here illustrates the whole sort of research sequence, where we had both aerial LiDAR, we had terrestrial LiDAR, we had extensive drone photography, and augmented reality applications and programs as well, to be able to actually go in and rebuild the landscape, so to speak. I'm going to give way to Danny so that he can explain a bit of the post-processing work that we did. So one of the things that I was able to negotiate with National Geographic, and they tend to be very complicated about this, was that we were able to negotiate that they turn over the complete data set rather than processed data. And this was really, really important to be able to extract the most information that we could, not only this year, but in following years, because it's very different to work with processed data rather than with the raw data. So we now, what we now have are a number of hard drives chock full of raw data. And what we began doing with Danny was, well, we've got all this information, we've got big data, so to speak, archaeologically, and you know, what do we do with it? How do we actually move into extracting real information for us rather than for a TV show? And how do we go from the beauty shots and the fancy drone work to the more interesting, the more sophisticated questions that we wanted to ask. So we began by setting up a very basic algorithm, and Danny is going to then give you an idea of the different iterations for that algorithm. But the basic algorithm was, well, this is an extremely broken topography. And what these people wanted were flat areas to live upon. And so what we're looking for are flat areas. And so what we have to begin doing with GIS is classifying all that point cloud and all that imagery so that we can locate those flat areas that are strewn all over the watershed. And so Danny is going to talk now about how we began doing that and how we actually began extracting the information that allowed us to find the new sites and begin doing more sophisticated analyses.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. Very happy of being here. So after this pretty video, let's take a couple of steps back and think of what one can see and what cannot see. And here in this image that I bring back from previous slides, we can see 40 years of archaeological research and conservation. And so we can see the open areas and the core sector of Ciudad Perdida. And we also see the dense vegetation that, as Santi said, covers a plethora and a lot of masonry architecture that belongs to the pre-Hispanic time of the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta. So we on the one hand, we can see this, and we cannot see those structures underneath the vegetation. But on the other hand, let's ask about what one has and what one does not have. For it allows to understand the importance and possibilities of LiDAR. So here we can see how this map illustrates a process whereby archaeologists became attuned to the attributes that makes an archaeological site an archaeological site. Those attributes yield the variables that we use to model the pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. That is the main class that we have been researching over the past year. And this finally illustrates the way such attributes that I will show in the next slide continue resonating with the current archaeological projects and allow us to identify more archaeological sites that could be reduced to variables such as extent and density of pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. These are the results, the black outlines, circular outlines, are the results of a recent pedestrian survey that I conducted in 2019 with the help of Alice Diaz-Chognon, that is a current student at the U of Chicago. And this illustrates how the results integrates to the 40 years of research that precede this project. So with all of this as a prelude, NatGeo, as Santiago said, grant us access to the raw LiDAR dataset. And of course, based on the literature on LiDAR and archaeology, we kind of knew what to expect from LiDAR, and we kind of knew what we need to do with LiDAR, but we didn't know how to do it. So after experiencing how steep is the learning curve of softwares like ArcGIS, LastTools, and eCognition, how steep is that learning curve? We made it to transform a messy point cloud of 5.05 billions of points into a classified point cloud that differentiates vegetation from ground. And this image illustrates that. Here we have on green, obvious, green vegetation, and on brownish, the ground. So we filter out, we strip away the vegetation, and we ended up with the ground, the cloud points of the ground. Then here you can see the details of the terraces, but also the details of the topography. Then we use these cloud points to create a DM that was the source to do a gradient analysis. And this first shows that gradient analysis is the best way to visualize archaeological structures in the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta. And this is so interesting, but up to this point, we replicated what Nat Geo did and produced a raster, a really, really cool raster. But our question goes a bit further, a nice visualization, and is asking how to make visualization significant to understand pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. And for approaching this, we created variables that build on 4 years of archaeological research and take the archaeological knowledge and make it, turns it into variables that then we incorporate to the software to teach the software how to identify archaeological sites. So, for example, we have slope that gauges the degree of relative flatness or steepness of the topography, and states that gradients from 0 degrees to 25 degrees correspond to prospective ancient settlements or croplands. Highly related to this, relief determines whether the geomorphology of the research area accords to round, flat, or crest-like landforms. And also related to this, the shape accords more to stone masonry, and how its morphology and layout that could be circular, oval, or elongated may or not may modify the landforms that underpin those structures. And finally, size allowed us to gauge the extent, density, and proportion of this class that we create as to be pre-Hispanic land use and occupation, but also it allowed us to filter out relative isolated areas that were smaller than 3 square meters. So first, because this is a really steep learning curve, we used or we conducted a manual cell based classification, and we use solely slope to undertake such analysis. And with this, we identify the areas that are outlined in purple as prospective archaeological sites or prospective areas of land use and occupation. It is important to know that those purple polygons were manually drawn. Basically, we used a visual comparison of how does Ciudad Perdida looks. And then we said, like, okay, let's now think that vegetation has not been clear from the other archaeological sites, and let's think how this could see. So we define these areas, and then we conducted a first ground truthing season and we visited the areas that are shown with red arrows. And we found the results, the really nice results, is that all of those areas correspond to archaeological sites. But after walking all of that, we also found that a couple of problems with this. But first, I want to show you the results. So these are some of the archaeological sites that we found. And we clear out this vegetation, just tiny, small portions of the vegetation. So we could show in the picture that we indeed found archaeological sites based on this first.
It wasn't just our imagination.
Yeah. Rather than our imagination, and using this really rudimentary reading, because this is really rudimentary, and this is the problem of this reading of this classification. On the one hand, It's not appealing, as you can see. It's kind of ugly. But on the other hand, it's pretty confusing because we had to draw manually all of these polygons. And we are not machines who play thoroughly with several variables at the same time. So we could be overlooking some of the variables. So we needed to refine this reading. And this is where OVIA comes to play. OVIA stands for Object-Based Image Analysis. And instead of using or focusing on the pixel level, it uses the aforementioned variables to create objects. And those objects are the source to do the modeling of the location of archaeological sites that actually we created a broader class that is pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. So this first algorithm, we use 3 algorithms to conduct OVIA. And this first algorithm that is called threshold-based algorithm, we solely, again, use slope. And what that showed us is that we came up with a really conservative result that overlooked or failed to identify the known extent of Ciudad Perdida. It, of course, could identify flat areas, as you can see, but it failed to actually model what is an anthropogenic area. So we proceed to use other 2 algorithms that are RF, random forest, and CART, that is classification and regression trees, to model the pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. And they yielded really comprehensive figures and indexes of pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. But those different, contrastingly, in contrast to the first algorithm we used, these 2 are supervised classification. So we needed to define or to use training samples to train the software so it could know what is an archaeological site or what is an area or prospective area of pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. We used the historical knowledge from archaeology. We used the knowledge from known areas of Ciudad Perdida and known areas that are close to Ciudad Perdida, but we did not use, and it was purposely, we did not use the results from the first ground truthing season, because we used that for conducting a kind of retrospective accuracy assessment of our processing with these 2, and actually with these 3 algorithms. So we use those 2 algorithms, and the results are pretty striking. And they strongly suggest an occupation and land use ranging from 96 hectares to 112 hectares. 96, the CART algorithm, and 112, the RF algorithm. And this is comparable, these results are comparable with 2 cases in Mesoamerica and Cambodia of low intensity agricultural urbanism. And this is really important because it not only allows us to establish a thorough conversation on urbanism, but also it allows us to rethink and reimagine local ways of thinking the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta that conventionally deem it as a pristine environment or untouched. But now with this, we can see that it has been highly modified, and we have this first way to approach it. So what we need now, and as we move forward, we made this first round of ground truthing, but CART and RF algorithms, they show similar results. And now they have similarity indexes of 74.9%. So in the end of the day, more than asking whether one of the algorithms is better than the other, thought we need to ask that question. I think the next step is conducting a more intensive ground truthing season that allows us to understand how the software is modeling the location, not only the location, but the extent and density of pre-Hispanic land use and occupation. And just to maybe give some sense of the differences between RF and CART, CART just use one line of decision trees, whereas RF, the other algorithm that showed more area of land use and occupation, it used a lot of tree decisions. So it kind of silenced the outliers, whereas CART let us pay more attention to the outliers data on our data set. Mm-hmm. So now that we have this, there are future and ongoing analysis that we are conducting. On the one hand, it is we are analyzing visual relationships within the archaeological site of Ciudad Perdida, and we conduct what is called a cumulative viewshed analysis after identifying the border and limits of the archaeological sites. We wanted to test the relationships between the sectors that comprise Ciudad Perdida in terms of visual relationships. So as Santi is going to address briefly, this right image shows the visual relationships between the Eje Central or the core area and the rest of the sectors of Ciudad Perdida.
Okay, and so very shortly to wrap up, some of the other questions that we're trying to address are that there's been a topic for quite a while now in the Sierra regarding visual dominance, say from certain areas, say from Ciudad Perdida towards some of the other sites in the surrounding area, but we had no way of actually understanding whether this could be a fruitful undertaking or if it was just wishful thinking. And so with the LiDAR data, what we're beginning to understand are questions of intervisibility, because it's not sort of a panopticon structure wherein from one site you can see all sites, but rather the visibility chains from one site to another. So that's one thing. And also because these sites are so massive and slope differences are so high and so steep, we don't know what, it's very difficult to be precise as to what can be seen from certain parts, whereas what can't be seen from other parts of the site. And then what's also very important is that usually for archaeological purposes, you strip away all of the information regarding vegetation. And we have massive amounts of information regarding a 450-year-old forest, wherein what we're trying to understand right now with this data is the correlation between certain types of ecosystem structure post-abandonment processes and what areas were inhabited versus what areas were cultivated versus what areas still have relics of primary forests. So basically to wrap up and to say thanks to all the audience, what we've been able to do with LiDAR has been to really be able to understand the extensive occupation in this basin in a more thorough manner, in a more precise manner, with better quality data that allows us to move less randomly in the forest. We can actually now go into particular areas to do ground truthing in a relatively efficient manner. So we spend less time sweating, more time thinking for the most part. And one of the more important aspects also is that it allows us to really understand the extent of transformation of how these pre-Hispanic peoples transformed a 6.6 kilometer part of a watershed into a completely inhabited cultural landscape full of towns, croplands, farms, and movement of people throughout a very, very complicated landscape. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you both so much for your presentation. We have a couple questions coming in now. So if people want to stick around for a few extra minutes.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Okay, so here we've got, has the prospect of using this technology to study escaped slave settlements in the nearby coastal areas? No, we haven't used this technology. We do know the location of most of the escaped slave settlements. There's actually one pretty nearby, which is in a town now called Dibuya, which used to be San Sebastián de la Ramada. And then we've got Palenque, which is near Cartagena. And that's still in use. It's still inhabited. So there's been no need, but it would be interesting actually to maybe tease out some of the settlements in San Andres and Providencia and in some of the other coastal areas. That would be interesting.
But it also occurs to me that not related to the use of LiDAR, but that the Sierra, because of its historical condition of being kind of isolated and out of range, could be not a place for escaping, but also a place for losing track of whatever was after you. But I think that's largely overlooked in current research, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think many people are using LiDAR for quilombos and for palenques, but I think it would be useful. It would definitely be useful. And it would also be useful to understand some of the weird settlements like the Scottish colony off of Urabá as well, those areas. Then we've got Rodrigo's question. Yes, absolutely. One of the more interesting aspects of LiDAR is that it's allowing us to tease out the structure of these road networks, for one. And so, because what usually happens when we're out in the forest is that we find sections of the paths, but we don't know, we usually know what's at the end of part of the path, but we don't know at the beginning where we start, but we don't know what's at the end. And you find like random staircases in the middle of the forest and all this sort of thing. So LiDAR is actually helping us to tease out, to actually, put together the different sections that we find in the forest, as well as water management, canals as well, cisterns, farming fields. Yes, it gives us a way more comprehensive understanding of the extent of the transformation, as it will. It's extremely useful. Extremely useful.
I would complement this with the kind of data that we could use for this, because for more detailed kind of architectural survey, we would prefer better to use terrestrial LiDAR, as it would allow us to even go as deep as thinking the sequences of building. And on the other hand, for identifying farming fields and croplands, whatnot, we are currently working on defining variables, significant variables for thinking production of maize crop, but also other kind of tree species that were that the Teyuna people or the pre-Hispanic communities of the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta were using at the time. But again, this is an interplay between how we think the variables and how we think the variables to be significant for identifying such areas. We created this broad category of land use and occupation, but we need to refine it for just thinking, for example, occupation, and thinking what we mean by land use, and if we can go as deep as thinking those variables.
So one of the more interesting aspects is, and I think Shannon posted the question and then kind of erased it, but I did read it via my speed reading abilities.
Up to the top because of the upvoting.
Or it was upvoted. Is it up? Oh, there we go. Because I was at the end and I was like, where'd it go? So one of the things that's really interesting is that for the most part, processual archaeology thought that machines were intelligent and that you could leave the classification processes, for the most part, to the machine. I mean, you just fed it a number of variables and then it kind of produced the data. Whereas what we've been trying to do is train the algorithms and use algorithms based on our own experience, as Danny was saying, on 40 years of archaeological research, so that we can add exactly what you were saying, that element or hunch function, where it's actually your own knowledge as an archaeologist that has been working in a particular area for many, many years that informs the AI or the algorithm or whatever equation it is that you're actually designing. So it's based, in short, yes, I mean, what we are definitely trying to do is to add that element of field savvy that we now have after walking for any number of years out there in the forest, wherein you start getting these, I don't know, like the tingly sensation at the back of the neck where you go like, it's near, it has to be near. You know, there's something that kind of leads you to conclude that that was an appropriate area for living and that very soon you're going to find it. And so what we're trying to do with these algorithms and with these classification processes is to make it a bit more efficient for us. But we're definitely trying to add that random, that element of serendipity wherein, I mean, we've actually found structures only because we've been lost, right? Because we take a wrong turn in the forest because we're lost out there. And suddenly you slam into this wall or you see this random staircase out in the middle of nowhere and you go like, oh man, you know, if we had been doing, say, doing like a stratified sampling program, or if we had been doing, you know, traditional survey work, that area would have been eliminated. Because it's too steep, because it's you know, because it's because it's not part of your sampling program. It's not part of your sampling pattern. And then basically when you do that, you eliminate that capacity for hunch or for serendipity. And we're definitely not trying to eliminate that, but to build upon it.
Yeah, and that being said, and we developed that idea, we elaborate on that idea in the paper that we are submitting in the near future, that we're not whether, even if we are taking this core of variables, we are not intending to reduce pre-Hispanic land use and occupation to such those four variables on the one hand. And on the other hand, this is really interesting because this interplay between human archaeological knowledge and computer resources also allows you to think how the archaeological sites have been behaving after abandonment. Because we had some areas that when we were walking that path, well, no path, we were essentially lost. But the GPS was telling us, there you have an archaeological site. And we were walking there just thinking like, this is not happening. This won't be an archaeological site. It's not possible. But then we got there and it was an archaeological site. And then what was happening is that we were overlooking how the sediment was growing above of the archaeological structures and these anthropogenic areas that we simply were failing to identify. But then we said, we thought like, okay, let's use the machete, let's use a little bit of troll to see if there is indeed an archaeological site here. And there were archaeological sites. So this is an interplay that, again, led us to think of this not human perfect, but non-human modeling skills of machines and humans. So, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt the conversation, but we need to wrap up. And before we go, I want to take a moment to thank both Santiago and Danny for sharing their research with us. And I also want to take a moment to thank Silvia Escarcega, who has been translating all of this into Spanish as we've been having this wonderful discussion. There's a lot of information in the chat window. So if you're interested to find out more about the work that Santiago and Daniel do, we've included links to their web pages. We've also included links to the upcoming events in this series. And you can always find out more information if you email class@uchicago.edu. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Santiago and Daniel.
Thanks, everyone. It's just
Thank you so much,
fun
everyone.
to do this at U of C.